Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia. This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning. Hi there, hello there.
Hello.
Hi.
So I've got a question, an opening question, if you will.
Yeah, do it.
How many existential crises did you navigate today?
Do I count repeat ones
I
as
think
different or same?
No, I think they count as different.
I think I'm up to 4.
Up to 4. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable number.
4, I'm kind of rounding up.
Okay.
There's like a half in there.
You need half crises.
It didn't develop into a moment where I thought I was going to have a panic attack. That's why it gets a half.
Got you.
The rest I was like, it's close.
Incoming.
What about you? If we're collecting yikes, how many yikes do you have for
I think
the
I
day?
have probably about 7 or 8 yikes
Really?
in my bin today.
For the day?
Yeah. Several, for sure.
I'm just letting everyone know now, I am once again sick. I don't know what to tell you. It's fall spring. Just deal with this. It's 65 degrees today. It was 3 degrees last week. That is not hyperbolic. That is a fact.
Yep.
So, am I sick again? Yes, of course I am. Why wouldn't I be?
That's teacher life. Lucky you.
So now I really sound like that teacher in the classroom. They all think I'm trying to make a point, and I'm like, no, I'm just trying to breathe.
That's just breathing.
It's just me trying to work it out.
Okay, so a note.
The most pregnant pause of pauses.
There's an awful lot going on geopolitically right now. This show covers sometimes current events.
Sometimes we try.
In
Right
the
now I
US.
can't keep up because I can't refresh my feeds quick enough.
Right. We're based in the US. We cover a lot of news and events having to do with the US education system. We talk about the US public school system a lot because Katie is a part of it. There is huge transformation underway right now. A lot of it is very scary for us and a lot of our peers who are public servants. With all of that going on, it can be difficult to concentrate on projects like this, our podcast, because we feel as though we should be spending our energy addressing other things that we see going on around us. But Katie and I both have been talking a lot about the things that we need to do to kind of exercise our own strengths through all of this. And one of the ways that we do that is by creating this community around learning and education and teaching, and by working on this podcast. That's how we feel like we use our brains for good. So we want to acknowledge what's going on and say we love and appreciate teachers, especially public school teachers in the US. We see what's going on. We're going to attempt to be the advocates that we want to be for people who need it through all of this. And
We're going to do our best to keep up our schedule.
Yeah.
And do what we do, but due to these unprecedented times, there are just maybe episodes that don't happen. And we might just come back and be like, hi.
Yeah.
Well, we just needed a little, so.
We're just not sure of the impact it may have on our schedule moving forward or on our ability to continue delivering this content. So we'll see what happens, but thank you for hanging in with us.
We're doing our best.
If you want to keep in touch with 16 to 1 podcast or other Moonbeam Multimedia news, events, resources, sign up for the 16 to 1 podcast email newsletter. And one more quick announcement. We're almost at the end of it, but it is still actively National News Literacy Week.
No thanks.
The week in which none of us want to be literate of the news. But this
I
is...
wish I couldn't read right now. I wish I'd never
Says
won.
the English teacher.
I wish Book It hadn't existed. That's where I am.
She's joking. She doesn't mean it. It's National News Literacy Week. And if you want educator resources, activity planners, events, other things for the classroom, for teachers related to news and media literacy, go to newsliteracyweek.org to find out more information. Got some great projects going on. And now more than ever, we need news literacy. Let's just jump into the main topic.
Let's talk about Jerome.
Jerome Bruner. Had you heard of this guy before this?
I I'd heard of his work, not of him.
Yeah.
Could not have placed his name to it.
Highly influential and respected developmental psychologist, cognitive psychologist.
Still using his stuff today?
Yeah, yes, for sure. There's a term associated with this guy that you probably have heard.
Yeah.
And
It's one of
listeners,
my favorite education bingo spots.
the most used square on the education bingo board.
It's up there.
Scaffolding.
Yeah.
Okay, I just thought that came down from the heavens, Deus Ex Machina style, and was just kind of delivered to teacher education programs. But it turns out it actually comes from somewhere and someone.
It wasn't pre-programmed in your brain when you thought about education?
It wasn't the platonic form of education rattling around up there. But no, so that term, scaffolding, was popularized in education and social science circles through the work of Jerome Bruner and a couple other people, as we'll talk about. It's not clear that he originated the term, but he certainly made it more popular and probably is responsible for so many professional development sessions.
I owe him many an hour of PD, yes.
So
thank you, Jerome.
He's an influential, barrier-breaking cognitive psychologist. He was also a pioneer of cross-disciplinary study.
He's a liberal arts fellow.
He is a liberal arts fellow. He liked to study music and physics and law and worked in many of these domains throughout his career.
Do you want to hear a little bit about how he got started?
I would love to.
Okay. He lived to be 100.
Oh,
Isn't that crazy?
Yes, that's a long life.
So he was born in 1915 in New York City to Polish Jewish immigrants. And he was actually born blind from cataract and had corrective surgery at age 2 that partially restored his vision. I'm trying to imagine what cataract surgery would have been like in 1917.
For a 2-year-old baby.
Yeah.
Okay. That's kind of nuts, actually.
Yeah, I know. When I started thinking about it, I was like, I don't like it.
He is pictured wearing pretty thick glasses through most
like
of
every
his life.
picture I saw of him were like Coke bottle.
Right.
Okay, so a little bit about his background. He has a bachelor's from Duke University, from the Blue Devils, from 1937. What if I did that for every college?
Harvard? Is that
Harvard
Crimson?
is, I think they're just the dweebs, the Crimson Dweebs. They're the librarians.
The Crimson Librarians. The Bloody Librarians.
The Bloody Library. Okay. And then a Bulldog.
Stop it.
What was the Sorbonne? What's their...
The French countryside. Stock of wheat.
Stock of wheat.
Wheat
a
stocks.
baguette.
Baguettes. The Sorbonne baguettes.
Okay. So, Jerome Bruner, a bachelor's from Duke in 1937, a master's and a PhD in psychology from Harvard in 1939 and 1941. And then he returned to teach at Harvard in 1945 after serving in the Army Intelligence Corps.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
World War II probably
We've
then.
got some,
All right.
some tough stuff happening there. So then he goes on to co-found Harvard University's Center for Cognitive Studies in 1960. Fun fact, critic and linguist Noam Chomsky started his career there.
Oh, at the Center for Cognitive Studies?
Yeah.
Huh.
So he leaves to teach at the University of Oxford in the UK in 1972. And then he returns back to the United States in 1980. And then in 1991, he joined the faculty at New York University, where he primarily taught in the law department.
Jeez.
So then he went on, because he didn't quite have enough yet. He has honorary doctorates from Columbia, the New School, Yale, the Sorbonne, and a number of other colleges and universities throughout Europe. So
Jeez.
I guess Duke, Harvard, and every Oxford just wasn't enough for the man. He got to catch them all.
That's an impressive pedigree. The man is well learned.
Yeah, like when you look at a lineup of education, it does not get much better. And I also just want to note that in 1991, he was still teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Crazy, Jerome.
Yeah, the man just loved teaching and learning.
Okay, so what was he doing? What was he focusing on?
Well,
other than being kind of a guy of the liberal arts.
That features pretty prominently in his ideas and in his life's work.
I would say based on his education, certainly.
Yeah. The way that I would sort of describe what he did is drag psychology beyond the borders that B.F. Skinner defined for it. Mm-hmm. And we have a whole episode on B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists.
We'll link it for you.
We will. We'll link it for you in the show notes. But Bruner, pretty thoroughly dethroned the behaviorists and replaced the focus with cognitive psychology, which is processes, conscious and unconscious, that are happening in the brain that are responsible for understanding information, learning, thinking, remembering, all of that. opposed to the behaviorists who are just sort of like, everything is stimulus and response, input, output machine. We're just beep, boop, trainable little automatons. Well, you can tell how I feel a little bit about the behaviorists from some of those.
I think I understand wholly how you feel.
So there's going to be a little bit of overlap in some of this with Bandura, with social learning theory. We also have an episode on that we can link to in the show notes. But Bruner does lean pretty heavily on what's called constructivism. And that's just the idea that, children, but also other people who are learning, are doing their own work kind of inside their own heads. They're actively constructing their own understanding of the world through their experiences and through thinking about those experiences. Yeah. Sounds straightforward and self-evident, is because cognitive psychology has taken such hold on us, and that's just sort of how we understand the world now. But it was revolutionary at a time.
Can I tell you that some of the research I did was some a little bit of competition between him and Maria Montessori.
Oh, for sure. I can see that.
And I wrote a couple of articles from Montessori pushing back to say that it was Maria who did scaffolding and things like that.
Fighting for credit of scaffolding?
Yeah, and also just saying that this kind of thinking had already been applied to education in a way. It was very interesting. And I'm not discrediting either of them, obviously. We did a whole episode about Maria Montessori and Montessori schools, and I worked at a Montessori school. But I thought it was really interesting to hear the Montessori take of Bruner.
Personally, from what I read of Bruner in preparation for this and his writings and stuff, I don't think he would take full credit for all of his ideas. I think he would say he's participating in an intellectual tradition that starts thousands of years ago. So,
I don't think he would be,
in the contemporary education space, there's a lot of pressure around the commercial interests of, being seen and adopted, and schools buying your curricula and that kind of stuff.
He's not doing that competition.
So we're going to talk about scaffolding, and I think you're going to maybe speak to this a little bit, but this is not necessarily a new or revolutionary thing.
No.
And he even says that he's kind of picking up on concepts that he's borrowing from other thinkers when he develops.
Or that he experienced too,
We're just going to go through a couple of his big contributions to developmental and cognitive psychology, the stuff that's really relevant to schools and to teachers anyway. This is by no means exhaustive. One thing that I dug deep into is this idea of narrative psychology, which I hadn't really heard in that terms before, but he, in the early 1990s, Bruner, published a series of works on what he called the narrative construction of reality. Basically, the idea that self-development happens when you listen and construct meaningful stories. He talks a lot about narrative being a useful tool for understanding certain kinds of thinking and learning that we do. And he also talks about other kinds or modes of thinking. He talks about paradigmatic thinking, and that's kind of more when you're doing logical analysis or thinking about universal concepts. He says that's a different kind of thinking from narrative thinking. So anyway, that's one of his contributing ideas to psychology. Bruner is this proponent of this idea that children can learn even really difficult concepts, and children of any age can learn really difficult concepts if their cognitive processes are properly accounted for and if they're met by the instructor in a way that they can kind of understand. So he's got this idea that the job of the teacher is more about mining human intellectual potential than it is about training them to remember facts or figures or things like that. He also had this really fun quotation. This is actually from the Washington Post obituary for Jerome Bruner, but I wasn't sure. I'll link that in the show notes too. But he said, apparently, if you construct a classroom in which children must keep their seats, you're assuring that there will be a hyperactivity syndrome. So his work sort of shifts focus from students passively receiving knowledge, which may have been something that they did in accordance with behaviorism. He's shifting that perspective to say that students should be participating in and even driving their own learning. And he was big into this idea of discovery learning. Sounds familiar to John Dewey and other progressive educators. He also codified his own system of understanding how learning takes place in early childhood, modes of representation.
Yeah, so it's a 3-tiered system, and modes of representation is just different ways of turning information into knowledge using our memory. That's kind of at the heart of what this system is doing.
Yeah.
So the 3 modes are inactive, which is action-based from birth to a year-old. And then there's iconic, which is image-based from 1 to 6 years old, and then symbolic, which is language-based from age 7 and up. The inactive portion of this system is like a baby shaking a rattle and how that forms a muscle memory. The second stage is iconic, which is the ability to remember something in your mind's eye. When you're in this process, it's helpful to use images and diagrams like picture books because these people are usually between 1 and 6 years old.
Yeah. And these are like estimates and they're fuzzy borders.
It's different for everyone, of course.
It's not rigid.
But the last stage then is a symbolic one. It's the last to develop and it's probably the most flexible, and it's how we turn language into codes and symbols. So, like, one of the best examples of that is, like, how we read math equations, and we understand it to represent this whole other function or whatever, but we understand it through the symbols, and our language has developed far enough that we can discern what it's asking us to do. So, they're not mutually exclusive, like Chelsea said, they do overlap, but I think when I started thinking about picture books, as I started thinking about the picture books that I know my friends read to their kids and things like that, I can see those different levels even in the books that they read based on the age and appropriateness of it. So I like this. I don't know if he's doing something we didn't already know here, but I think he is putting language to it, which is important.
I think he's situating it in his larger project of cognition and how internal processes drive learning instead of just external ones. I also wanted to dive in a little bit to the scaffolding stuff because that became probably most popularized in terms of just the language that contemporary educators...
We're still talking about it. Yeah. And this year, the Lord has given us 2025. We're still scaffolding, folks.
We sure are. I was researching this. The credit for the concept really should be shared among several psychologists. And it sounds like even there's a Montessori interest in owning this too. But I traced it back at least as far to this Russian child developmental theorist named Lev Vygotsky. His work focused on what he called the zone of proximal development, which is basically the way in which learning could be sufficiently challenging, but not so challenging that you get frustrating as a learner. I don't know.
It's a very fine line.
But that's where this psychologist said that learning best happens, just challenging enough. So in this tradition of Vygotsky and the people that he influenced, scaffolding means that you're receiving help when you're learning or mastering some sort of material from somebody who can help you navigate the material. Way back in 1976, Bruner and two of his colleagues, David Wood and Gail Ross, published this paper called The Role of Tutoring in Problem Solving about, quote, the means whereby an adult or expert helps somebody who is less adult or expert. You're laughing.
I'm still looking for the more adult in the room to help me with the next adult thing.
Yeah.
To elevate my adulting.
Nobody says this cycle ever ends. And that's kind of where he develops this theory of scaffolding and how it works. But so what is I want the real teacher in the room to tell us what this is all about. You can read these papers and it's a little difficult to translate them directly to classroom practice. So what does scaffolding mean for you?
I would jokingly say that scaffolding is just good teaching.
Okay.
Like, I hate to be that glib, I guess. Like,
You're right. At the end of the day, this is really just...
It's good teaching.
What good teaching looks like, yeah.
But essentially what scaffolding is the teacher's work to build the student up to accomplish something more independently over time. So you start by giving them more and more structure. At the beginning, they have the most structure that they'll have, the most support.
Scaffolding, if you will?
Yes. Eventually, the building will stand without the scaffolding, right? Because you don't need it, because the work is done. It's kind of like the long game of teaching, I feel like. In my classroom, scaffolding is all of the things that I do that sets a routine. The first couple of weeks, I'll be like, read the board. What is first? You get out your Chromebook, whatever. And by this time of year, I just walk in the room and I just stare at them. And they just know. They're like, oh, I don't have a Chromebook. And so that's my scaffolding. I go from being very polite, very willing, to now I'm like, look at me, read my face. You know what this means, right?
Now I've gone from polite to threatening glare.
And I am a building and you are, so this is scaffolding being ripped off of you. But that's just one way it can be used, right? Expectations, behavior. The hope is that you set the tone for what you expect, and then over time they're able to achieve that with less and less help.
And more self-directed in the activity of learning.
It is. So that's why I jokingly say that scaffolding is just good teaching, because like, isn't the goal of teaching to at first invest the most, and over time they can get themselves through the process.
Okay, and then Bruner is also known for another somewhat related buzz term in educational circles, and that's spiral curriculum.
Yeah. It's basically the idea that just because you covered it once doesn't mean it's never going to appear again. This is kind of how he breaks it down, is that it's not just the repetition of it, but it's also the deepening of it. So you might at first revisit a topic, and then the second level is an increasing level of difficulty, and then the third is new learning that's related to the other part of the spiral, and then the fourth is like the competence of that student increasing over time. It's basically scaffolding, but in a different name. You keep adding to what you're teaching them, but you have to keep taking them back through the spiral to remind them of the learning along the way to accomplish the final whatever.
I have a question for you as a teacher about these kinds of metaphors. Do you think the metaphors are helpful, or are they a distraction?
No, it's a distraction.
Okay.
Because you know how long it took me to look at this? Okay, when I was researching, I got assigned spiral curriculum. Okay, so I Google it. And I'm, going through all of this stuff, and it's like this ancient text PDF of something from the, whatever year, and it's a spiral diagram. And I'm looking at it, and I'm going, this diagram makes no sense. But then as I read the parts of the diagram, I understand what the diagram is saying, but the diagram didn't actually tell me anything, except for it made a spiral.
I'm wondering why these abstractions,
they're not necessary.
They get crystallized, though, and they can be very easily repeated in teacher education programs.
Right.
But I think my question is, if I were teaching this, do I teach the concept called spiral curriculum?
No.
Or do I just say, hey, when you're teaching topics, you might need to reinforce them by revisiting them? I guess I'm just very curious about...
I would never tell them that we're doing spiral curriculums.
Right. But so what's the utility of these metaphors?
I was hoping you could tell me.
Okay. So you don't think there is utility to the metaphors?
Okay. So I know I've told this story multiple times on this podcast, but this is exactly what my dad was talking about, which was he would remember some tool from years ago, draw a chart, call it something close and be like, it's new. And everyone would be like, wow, Jack's so smart. And yeah, my dad's a smart guy, but this is teaching.
So is the metaphor created in order to get the tried and true tested concept that everybody knows is the right way to teach over and over again into the next generation's hands?
Sure.
I've heard him say, yes, education is, if you stay in education as a career long enough, you'll just revisit the same PD sessions over and over again. They have a new name.
I think that's the hokey aspect.
Okay.
It's well, let's put a bow on it and draw a spiral on the board. And we're going to make your district shill out whatever kind of money to learn about it. And then you're going to leave and be like, oh,
okay.
Teaching. Got it.
Yeah.
Nice. Because I can tell you, and I'm probably not smart enough to read the spiral diagram, I suppose, but I looked at it and I was more confused. If I put that diagram up on the board, my kids would be like, are you okay? Miss Day, you don't read diagrams.
It sort of looks like a tornado if you draw.
It does, but if I told, you know what, that's just distracting, personally. I think that spiraling... Spiraling. I think spiraling is really important. Personally, I think
love spiraling.
Spiral curriculum is another word or another phrase to just be recall. That's basically what it's doing. It's basically do you remember at the beginning of the unit when I explained why Nazi Germany was in the economic state that they were, and then a week later I'm like, okay, do you remember last week when we talked about the economic? That's basically what spiral curriculum is doing. It's encouraging them over time to keep drawing from what they've been learning
while difficulty increases.
Yes. So as things become more complex, as we learn more about the unit or whatever. But I would also just say that my hope is that my kids listened last week to write it down, to remember to apply it to future learning. So
I've told you this before, but when I edit the podcast, I have to make sure that our natural conversation, sometimes we end up repeating ourselves.
Yeah.
And the teacher of the two of us, that's Katie, I tend to have to edit more of what she says, not because what she's saying is wrong or unhelpful or something like that, but because she does this spiraling. She'll revisit, she'll be like, well, remember this, and she'll restate things in a slightly different way to aid in comprehension. And she'll be like, okay, and then wrapping things up, this kind of connects back to what we said.
Yeah.
She does a lot of that, but
hitting all of my angles.
Our podcast listeners don't necessarily need that much scaffolding. So we
My
end up we have to edit a little bit of the scaffolding.
I'm hitting all my swabbits.
Just for time.
All of my students will be able to. So that's what I'm doing.
I do want to circle back to questions putting this in context of B.F. Skinner and behaviorism.
Okay.
I won't go too far back into that, but we're now shifting to this cognitive focused approach. All of that's a little bit lofty, and I'm curious about how you put this more in concrete terms for what happens in your classroom.
Yeah.
What's the impact on the education system of moving from this idea that everything is learned through conditioning to everything is learned through internal processes, cognition that drives and shapes learning? How does a school system look different when it embraces one or the other of these attitudes?
I would say even some of what I was describing was a little bit of behaviorism.
Conditioning.
So, yeah, I mean, I think those do overlap. As I was describing it, I was certainly in my head describing scaffolding, but it is conditioning, right? I am showing them that this is how you act. I don't think one of them is ever not going to be a factor in schools.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think cognitivism is speaking more toward why conditioning works, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may be the case that you can kind of output certain behaviors for certain people at certain times, but it's also true that we have free will and that one student may come to a completely different conclusion from a given set of inputs from another student.
Yeah, and I really don't think people realize when they talk about teaching that a majority of teaching is the behavior of the students. I really don't think people spend enough time considering that when they think about what teachers do.
Well, because they think it's something that you can just kind of, you sit up there and do it, and they sit back there and receive it.
Like, all of my teaching depends on behavior, good and bad, right? But I really don't think that a lot of people on the outside of education consider how much of our job is behavior. So, that's all.
Yeah. We were talking about this earlier, but this interdisciplinary approach, how do you think that shaped or complemented his approaches to cognition and education and learning?
I think it only makes it better.
Yeah.
Personally. I mean, I am a product of a liberal arts private university, and I value still all of the types of learning that I got to do, because I think it gives even more context to everything, which I think is probably the most important thing.
Yeah.
I know this isn't quite apples to apples here, but I think an athlete is better when they play multiple sports. And I think it's the same thing about a learner. I think you learn or are more willing to learn when you are able to read things from all different types of disciplines.
He makes the case that knowledge is more domain specific than we've given it credit.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the case that things easily transfer from one domain of expertise to another.
Right.
Which is a reason to become an interdisciplinarian, right? But he's saying, no, we've kind of like, if you want to be good across fields, you have to study across fields.
Well, I'm teaching a Holocaust unit right now, and I think back about my education, and I learned about the Holocaust in religion classes, in history classes, in English classes, in communication classes in college. And so I think that kind of helps build that for me, too, is because isn't that the best way to learn from all of the possible avenues? I certainly wish that we had more time and access and support, and maybe we should fund it better. But
fund education?
Yeah, just a thought.
I've got a technology question. This discovery learning, this thing where students are driving their own learning. Do you think
student-led learning?
Yeah, for real. Do you think that technology and the internet have made that kind of learning more or less difficult?
Yes.
Okay.
I think yes, because when has it been easier for them to find things to learn about? But also no, because when has it, I think there's too much information at times, and I think that's overwhelming. I
think we have information flood, and I think especially now in this weird moment that we're occupying where the internet is sort of changing and like generative AI is sort of taking over, we're going to have even more information flood, and the information is going to become less and less trustworthy over time. Yeah. And I actually kind of feel bad for students who are really self-directed learners right now, who are curious and who are passionate about learning.
They're out there in it.
Yeah, they're just out to sea in a storm right now. So keep an eye on them and help them, because it's going to be tough times ahead, I think.
Yeah. I think right now it's maybe the most difficult it's been.
Yeah.
I hope that that's not always the case, of course, but that's why I said both. Sorry. It is kind of a cop-out, but I actually do believe it.
Uh-huh. And then just lastly here, Bruner, he was known for criticizing overly rigid classroom or learning structures and routines.
Yeah.
I don't think he too strongly overcorrected. I don't think he's like just a free-for-all kind of guy.
No.
I'm just kind of curious what the proper response is to this line of critique, because structure and routine those things definitely help learners, and it's part of scaffolding and stuff. But I also think what he said earlier, if you require children to sit in one place and not move and behave and act like good little robots, that's just setting yourself up for failure, because that's just not how kids act.
Yeah.
So where's the balance there?
It's something I'm still working through. I think at the beginning of my career, I was like, you will sit in your desk and you will have a pencil and you will have out your homework. And I thought that was effective. Mm-hmm. The more I teach, the looser it gets. And I think it's just because I have a better grasp of students now. I think I understand parts of myself better than I did even when I was a new teacher, or when I think about what I was like as a student who was nervous all the time and anxious and everything else. A couple years ago, I started teaching a general education population. So these are students who might or are more likely to be identified either 504 IEPs, needing special ed services, or probably not college bound. And what I realized that with that group of students is that what behavior looked like was different. That was one of those moments that I was like, you have to really throw out the baby in the bathwater right now, because I have to challenge everything that I thought I knew about what behavior looked like in my classroom. Everyone is learning. Everyone is safe. Everyone is mostly fine. I can only do so much. They're teenagers, but I'm okay too. People would probably walk into 2 of my periods right now and be like, what is happening? And I look around and they're quiet and working. And I'm like, don't ask questions, So I think that we should be criticizing an overly rigid classroom. I do not think we should criticize structure and routines. We have structure. We have routines. They know my limits. They know all of these things. But it takes a really long time to get there. And you have to be like so confident in yourself as an educator that you can hold it together. And that's hard. And I've talked about my teacher mentor, Terry, so many times on this podcast now, but like I spent so much time in her room watching her and realizing that her kids were learning more in what seemed like a more chaotic environment than what I believe my kids to be learning in what I would consider as like a more rigid place. And I was like, why? And it's because they're comfortable in Terry's room. And it's because I wasn't even letting them try to be comfortable in my room. Watching Terry is probably what really pushed me to challenge a lot of that. Here is the part of the episode where we ask you a question or fill in the blank. You write us in hello@16to1.com. Regardless of your correctness, we send you stickers.
Participation gets you a sticker in this classroom.
Participation goes a long way. You understand our structure. Welcome.
All right. Last episode's question.
Murray McCory died in October of 2024. Probably don't know that name, but you certainly know the famous brand he created. McCory was an avid outdoorsman and hated the fit of the scholarly item until he entered a competition while at the University of Washington to improve it. With some startup money from his dad, he made this dream a reality and created JanSport.
JanSport.
A great backpack.
Okay.
A staple.
All right.
Did you have a JanSport?
I don't think I ever had one of those, but a lot of my friends had them.
Really?
Okay, here's why. I needed more pockets. The JanSport of my youth was a very simple...
Okay, the JanSport of your youth, yes. The JanSport of our older years was not.
No. As we aged, the JanSport matured too. But the JanSport of our very early youth was too simple for me. I needed more pockets and organization in my bags. Okay. I always got Swiss Gear bags.
That tracks
because
for you.
that had gazillions of pockets and
like
flaps and folds and chains and buttons.
I don't actually know if I had a JanSport when I was really young. I had like a Chicago Bulls backpack. I had like a Pocahontas backpack. Nike. I had a couple Nike backpacks for sure. But the summer before before college, maybe. I think we were at, like, my mom and I were at TJ Maxx, somewhere like that, Marshall's. And I found, like, the most beautiful backpack. I loved it so much. It was maroon and, like, kind of gray. And it just looked so tough. Like, it had so many pockets.
A JanSport?
Yes. I wanted it so bad. And Mom got it for me. And I remember being like $40, which at the time felt very expensive for a backpack. This was like 2007, 2008. The rule was if she bought me this backpack, I had to use it all of college. And I had that thing until like 5 years ago. Best $40 investment from my mom. JanSport got me right through, did it all. So.
It is an iconic backpack for sure.
I'm sure I have so many photos of me traveling with that backpack too, because I took it everywhere. It went to Europe, it went all over. So big fan.
Cool.
Okay, what do you got?
Well, this question is about Groundhog Day. Very recently, Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow and predicted 6 more weeks of winter. In what year did Phil start predicting the weather in Pennsylvania? Other places now also have their own weather predicting creatures. We have Buckeye Chuck here in Ohio, General Beauregard Lee of Jackson, Georgia.
Sounds right.
Staten Island's Chuck of New York, Yep. And Billy of Balzac, Alberta, Canada. Just to name a few.
Yeah.
We have our very own creature here, but it's not a groundhog. It's in fact a fish.
It's a bass.
A Benny the bass.
All hail.
The local weather predicting creature.
If he takes the bait,
Spring can't wait.
spring can't wait.
Okay. And what did you learn in this last couple of weeks?
This is probably a recall to previous things we've talked about on this podcast, but if you did not know, Chelsea and I both love Vincent van Gogh a lot. Found an article that I've linked in the show notes from CNN. There has been a new Van Gogh found. It was found from a garage sale in Minnesota in 2016, and they believe it was made by Vincent van Gogh during his stay at a psychiatric hospital in the south of France in 1889, and he actually killed himself that next year. The piece is called Elmar, as that is the text that's found in the bottom corner. Historians have been trying to authenticate it since its discovery in 2016. It's taken a lot of research. They have confirmed its authenticity to the best of their ability, of course. But it does take a long time to look through the layers and the patterns of the piece to confirm that it's accurate. And they go through the materials and all those types of things. The people working on it have shared that they're not that surprised to be finding Van Goghs. Even still, so far they know that he's created more than 900 pieces of work or artwork. One thing about Vincent is that he did not really care much about records or anything that would be useful now.
Yeah,
he just gave things away.
He didn't think of himself as having any
Well,
talent
he
for a while.
didn't really have that much notoriety while he was living.
Right.
It was his sister-in-law and brother who did a lot of the work to make him famous. So anyways, I love living in a world where they are still discovering Van Goghs. I hope that it never stops. They believe that there's, of course, more. Why wouldn't there be more if they're finding them in Minnesota in 2016? But the last hurdle that this piece has to go through is it has to be sent to Van Gogh's actual space and be confirmed by them. And so that's like the last remaining thing.
Wow.
Because when it was first discovered, they rejected it. And so a team has been working on it since then to prove its authenticity.
We're going to have to follow that and see if they actually improve it this
I
time.
will follow it based on all of the historians and everything, it seems. Or as certain as they could be without him being here to be like, I did that.
Yeah.
So, new Van Goghs, the link is in the show notes. And it's unlike other stuff I've seen of him.
It is.
So, it's
kind of haunting.
It's very haunting, and it's actually based off of another famous art at the time, piece of art at the time. So, he was obviously inspired by a contemporary. I also think that if I had any sort of class, I would call him Van Gogh.
Van Gogh.
So anyway, new Van Gogh just dropped.
Okay.
What you got?
I finished a book. I'm trying to keep up with my reading habit. I finished a book by an author I've read before and talked about on the show, actually.
Okay.
James Gleick. He wrote The Information, which was this giant information theory book that I read a couple of summers ago on our road trip in audiobook form.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I sat through that.
He
slept through that.
He had previously written this book called Chaos, Making a New Science. I'd studied some of this stuff in college. I had a very history of science influence in my college experience, and so we read a lot of this stuff, and it kind of felt like revisiting some of that thinking that we had done in college, and it was It was sort of fun. But yeah, just chaos theory, how the science of chaos came to be, how mathematicians and scientists, material scientists, everybody has an interest in what chaos looks like, how you chart it, in the same vein as the information, where it's this really broad overview of this difficult scientific thinking. But it's a really great introduction to the field. It was a pretty beefy read, but I like diving into stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I learned about.
Link in show notes.
Link in show notes.
Okay.
Anything else? Final thoughts, parting shots?
Yeah. Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please go rate, review, and subscribe. That helps us quite a bit, and we appreciate it. And we appreciate you as we keep trudging through year 5 here. Take care of yourselves, and we will be back.
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show.
They're supposed to do that when they're understimulated. She's mad because I took away her laptop. She's a sticky iPad cat.
Jeez.